Hello, Congressman. We are a group of experts here to brief you on the complexities of the pharmaceutical industry before your big hearing. Let me first start off by giving you the rundown on corporations and why they exist. A corporation is a legal entity created through the laws of its state of incorporation. The law treats a corporation as a legal person that has a standing to sue and be sued, distinct from its stockholders. The legal independence of a corporation prevents shareholders from being personally liable for corporate debt. In the United States, a corporation is made up of three parts: shareholders, a board of directors, and officers. Within a corporate structure, the shareholders are the owners of the company, while the board of directors and officers manage the business, often with the help of employees. So you may be asking, what is a corporation? And by definition, a corporation is a legal entity that is separate and distinct from its owners. Under the law, corporations possess many of the same rights and responsibilities as individuals. They can enter contracts, loan and borrow money, sue and be sued, hire employees, own assets, and pay taxes. So you might be questioning, what is the purpose of a corporation? And the purpose of a corporation is to conduct a lawful, ethical, profitable, and sustainable business in order to create value over the long term, which requires consideration of the stakeholders that are critical to its success. Now that you understand a little better about the purpose and structure of corporations, I want to give you my own personal opinions on if pharmaceutical companies should be incorporated to help you better prepare for any questions you may be asked. Let me first start off by saying Big Pharma reaps benefits while hurting American citizens daily, but the problem with pharma goes well beyond cost. There are two sides to this argument, and I believe both hold strong grounds. On one hand, one may argue that pharma should be incorporated because if a drug isn't affected or if it's ineffective or causes damage to individuals, the shareholders will not be liable. Having pharmaceutical companies be incorporated also provides a way for industry to build capital to provide funding for research to develop new drugs. On the other hand, if a drug fails, there'll be little liability to the corporations and nobody would be held responsible for the damages caused. One of the most vital examples of why pharmaceutical companies should not be incorporated can be proven in an example surrounding type 1 diabetes. This is a condition where individuals cannot naturally produce insulin to regulate blood sugar. Without insulin, the body can suffer fatal consequences. It has been shown that 1 in 4 Americans have claimed to have engaged in insulin rationing due to extreme prices of drugs. What is insulin rationing? It's when you take a lower dosage than prescribed to have your current dosage last longer in order to save money. This can be dangerous to those who need the correct dosages and often results in fatalities. Due to the fact that pharmaceuticals are not commodities and that the companies are incorporated, they have a say in the price of their goods. The prices have been going up exponentially in the past decade and are having detrimental effects on US citizens who suffer with this disease. You can see the price inflation in the graph on the right. So, although there are pros and cons to both sides of the argument, in my opinion, it is important to keep in mind that when handling people's lives, morals should weigh heavier than capital gain.
So the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, is a governmental agency that was established to protect the health of the public. So they regulate a bunch of different things, including pharmaceutical drugs, biological products, medical devices, food supply, cosmetics, and tobacco. So really, just anything that has could have an overall health impact on the population, right? So this is a quote from the FDA website itself, and they say FDA is responsible for advancing the public health by helping to speed innovations that make medical products more effective, safer, and more affordable, and by helping the public to get the accurate, science-based information they need to use medical products and foods to maintain and improve their health. So that's what they claim. we will see the, how much truth there is to this in the future here. So how exactly are new drugs approved? So it starts with research and development and the discovery of a new drug. And then that goes into the preclinical testing, which usually is performed on animals like mice or rats. This is just to assess the safety and biological activity of the drug. And so once this passes, this is where they file the IND, or investigational new drug, and they enter phase one. So phase one, 20 to 100 healthy volunteers to determine the safety and dosage of the drug. And then they go into phase two with 100 to 300 patient volunteers. So not necessarily just healthy volunteers. So, this is now incorporating a wider audience in it too. And then this evaluates effectiveness and side effects as well. And then finally, phase three, they get 1,000 to 3,000 patient volunteers, and they verify the effectiveness and monitor adverse long-term use, which is, also goes on after it's on the market too. But that's where they file the NDA, and the FDA will review and address any concerns with the new drug before it's fully approved for manufacturing. And then there also exists, a fourth phase after this, where the FDA conducts, post-market reviews and studies any rare adverse reactions, that are associated with it. So this sounds, good and all sounds very thorough, but there are a couple problems with the FDA, the way it is structured. The FDA does not conduct their own research. So any research that they are presented with is presented by the pharmaceutical company. And many times, the pharmaceutical company will cherry pick the data to give to the FDA. So they are only presented with this limited amount of data that shows significant results that the drug works and it's good. So that is one problem. And then another problem is the post-market review, not necessarily as thorough as it should be, because a lot of times they rely on doctors to report adverse effects to the FDA, but many times they won't. Many times, a patient will come in with something, the doctor will undermine the patient's circumstances and be, well, it should be fine. But then, these reactions aren't ever reported, which is a bad thing. And then finally, the 510K, which was written as an exception to help speed up the process. Basically, it just says that if there is a previous medical device that a new one is based off of, then it can get like a pretty fast approval process. This is what happened with this Cobalt hip implant. It was based off of previous hip implants, and it went through the 510K process and got approved. But it eventually caused cobalt poisoning in many people who got the hip implant. So just because something is similar or does the same thing as a previous device does not mean it's the exact same, and doesn't mean it doesn't need to be studied at all. And unfortunately, most medical devices are approved through this 510K process.
So the question being asked is, should drugs be approved after phase two? But there is also a phase three. So phase two trials have hundreds of participants. This is where the drug is administered to its target population rather than healthy individuals. This stage is mostly to test safety within this group, and it is compared against a placebo group. This process only compares medications to placebos, not old medications that it might compete against. Phase three trials, on the other hand, have thousands of participants. It tests the efficacy of the drug and the effect of various dosage amounts on those people. This is phase three trials are a double-blind trial to ensure that biases do not come into play, since both the experimenters and participants do not know if they are receiving a placebo or the actual drug. If a drug passes phase three, then it proves the efficacy of the drug. So therefore, drugs should not be approved after phase two, since phase two trials only involve hundreds of participants, as opposed to phase 3 trials, which include a lot more participants, and it is completely random. So it better proves efficacy. So who is liable if the FDA makes a mistake? The Food and Drug Administration is a government agency that is responsible for the passage of newly approved drugs onto the market for consumption by consumers. Although the FDA is directly responsible for ensuring safety and efficacy of the drugs that pass into the market, it is not inherently liable due to the immunity granted by its governmental affiliation. The FDA is part of the government and therefore cannot be sued by an individual party. Some states allow pharmaceutical companies to be sued, but not all. This means that any accident that happens is not the liability of the FDA. And this is scary because pharmaceutical companies can get away with a lot since they cannot be sued by individual parties. And it's easy for the FDA to kind of keep their hands clean of anything that goes on. So what is IP? IP stands for the intellectual property. Intellectual property are defined as creations of the mind, such as inventions, literary and artistic works, designs and symbols, names and images used. Intellectual property is related to pharmaceutical companies because big pharma tends to patent their medicines and synthesis processes so that it becomes an infringement of legal rights to reverse the engineering of their drug so that nobody else can steal their invention.
So next, Mr. Congressman, we're going to be looking at what structure does the U.S. legal system provide for intellectual property issues. The first case we're going to look at is the Moore case from 1990, where cells were taken from patients without their consent, and research ended up patenting these cells after research was done on them. And Moore argued that these cells were their intellectual property and therefore were owed profits made from the patent. The court ruled against Moore because they said cells weren't technically a part of him anymore, and you couldn't automatically claim intellectual property because they weren't part of you and you didn't do anything to them. And then the next case is Myriad Genetics, 2013, where they tried patenting the BRCA gene. It was denied by the court because they didn't modify or create the gene. It was naturally occurring. Like all they did was develop tests that, yep, this gene shown to increase likelihood of breast cancer. The court said you can't do that because you can't patent naturally occurring substances, which is different than what happened in Moore, because in Moore, he didn't do anything to his cells, which is why he couldn't claim intellectual property. But the researchers that took his cells modified it through the research and then were able to get the patent. Because they changed it, that's why they could get the patent. And next, we'll look at the Patents Act of 1970 versus 2005 changes. In 1970s, the act detailed what could be patented for pharma products. It said you could patent the process for making pharma products, but you couldn't patent the substance itself, which companies didn't like because they wanted control of the substance. They didn't want anybody could make Advil as long as they did it a different way than this other company. So in 2005, they basically omitted this section that was in the 1970s Act. And they also changed the wording on what qualifies as a new substance. And here a new substance is not different if it does not result in improved efficacy. So now companies could just make a small change to the chemical structures, like adding an ester group to it. And as long as it showed improved efficacy, it was a new substance, and they could continue to make boatloads of money off of this without actually changing it. And now we're going to look at what ethical issues surround intellectual property and should the government step in. Some of the ethical issues surrounding this are violations of respect for autonomy, specifically informed consent. If you take the Moore case, for example, the researchers weren't telling him the whole story, saying, yeah, we're going to take these cells from your cancer treatment. We're going to do a little bit of research on them, modify them a bit, and when we get a patent, we can make boatloads of money off of this. And technically, if you get on the patent with us, you could be making this money too, but we're not going to tell you. So we can solely earn that money. And Moore could have argued that since they withheld information from him, this wasn't informed consent. He couldn't make an informed decision, therefore making the treatment unethical. And should the government address these issues? Yeah, they should, but it's easier said than done because big pharma companies benefit from the current intellectual property patent laws that are in place. And who can change these laws or make new laws that big pharma wouldn't benefit from, that the consumer would benefit from? Congress. But who's paying the majority of the salary for Congress people? Big pharma companies. Who gets these Congress people elected? By donating lots of money to their political campaigns. Big pharma companies. So big pharma is controlling Congress. Whatever agenda they want to push, big pharma companies will get it done.
So, Congressman, you may be asking why drug prices are so high. Well, drug prices are so high because essentially pharmaceutical companies set them that high. There is little competition in the pharmaceutical industry because large drug companies have monopolies over patents and means of production, and the market for pharmaceuticals is always in need of drugs. That being said, drugs are not a commodity in the US, even though mostly everyone needs them. So the price of drugs are determined by the company selling them. The federal government can't put a price cap on drugs, so bringing drugs down to an affordable price is left to health insurance companies, and even they might not pay for some drugs depending on the illness or procedure. Now, you may be wondering why the government hasn't done anything to help lower drug costs, which is totally untrue. Let's give an example. A man by the name of Martin Shkreli took advantage of this loophole more audaciously than any other CEO. He raised the price of a life-saving HIV drug from $13.50 to $750. Not because this accounted for research and development, but because he simply could maximize profits for the drug that people have to buy. Congress took action immediately, putting the pharma bro on trial and finding him guilty of nothing. He basically did what he could do as a CEO. Eventually, he went to jail for securities fraud, but instead of actually doing their job and passing legislation to put a price cap on drugs, Congress decided to instead let this guy be the face of the industry and perform some political theater. Congress also attempted to pass a law recently to lower the price of drugs. However, the two Democrats that had the deciding vote on the bill both voted against the bill and were the most paid Democrats by pharmaceutical companies. So Congress really hasn't done that much. Drug companies say that the cost of bringing a drug from research to market costs around $802 million, sometimes even more. However, this number is not backed by any factual information, and drug companies picked what data they wanted to report to the one university that conducted the study that came up with the $802 million number. Pharmaceutical companies actually seldom release their data for spending on drug development, so it is unclear exactly where they came up with this $802 million number. When actually having to disclose their books, the cost of marketing and making a drug is around $403 million. The extra $399 million is added on for a magical scheme called cost of capital. Basically, cost of capital is the apparent risk it is to market and make the drug based on how much money it could have made on the stock market for a duration of time. So pharmaceutical companies add an imaginary amount of money that was never gained or lost onto the cost of drug development in order to increase the price of drugs. As far as research goes, pharmaceutical companies don't technically do their own research. Public grants from the federal government fund research to universities to develop new drugs or different types of treatment. Under the Bayh-Dole Act, universities and other private entities can own the patent to newly developed drugs that are sponsored by public grants from the federal government. So as these universities create new drugs and create patents for drugs, pharmaceutical companies come in and buy the patent in order to mass produce the drug. Then pharmaceutical companies will pay the vast majority of their money on marketing the drug and selling it for a way over inflated price to consumers. Now, you may be wondering where the consumer sits in this circle of capitalism. Well, the consumer pays taxes to the federal government to use for grants to pay universities for researching new drugs. Then the consumer buys the drugs back from the pharmaceutical companies at an overpriced amount, all while pharmaceutical companies make billions selling Me Too drugs and dodging federal income tax by putting their revenue in Swiss bank accounts. So the consumer essentially takes all the burden for researching and developing drugs, as well as keeping the cycle going. So if we were to lower the price of drugs, pharmaceutical companies will not be put in jeopardy. There will be no shortage of need for pills because Americans spend about $200 billion a year on pharmaceuticals, and that number grows about 12% every year. The pharmaceutical industry is a $1 trillion industry. The market for pharmaceuticals will only grow as the population grows. Most of the pharmaceutical industry's money goes towards marketing. So lowering the costs wouldn't necessarily affect research and development of drugs, nor would it be detrimental to the overall revenue of the already $1 trillion industry. We can pass legislation to regulate pharmaceutical companies for making drugs, to incentivize them to fund university research, and to make sure all their products are clinically tested and thoroughly researched. This will hold the pharmaceutical industry accountable and responsible. Thank you so much for listening, Congressman. We hope this video helped, and we are so sorry for your loss. Now go out there and make a difference.